Chapter 8. Sometimes I think Wolf Larsen mad, or half mad at least, what of his strange moods and vagaries. At other times, I take him for a great man, a genius who has never arrived. And finally, I am convinced that he is the perfect type of primitive man, born 1,000 years or generations too late, and an anachronism in his culminating century of civilization. He's certainly an individualist of the most pronounced type. Not only that, but he is very lonely. There is no congeniality between him and the rest of the men aboard ship. His tremendous virility and mental strength wall him apart. They are more like children to him, even the hunters, and as children he treats them, descending perforce to their level and playing with them as a man plays with puppies. Or else he probes them with the cruel hand of a vivisectionist, groping about in their mental processes and examining their souls as though to see of what soul stuff is made. I have seen him a score of times, at table, insulting this hunter or that, with cool and level eyes, and withal a certain air of interest, pondering their actions or replies or petty rages with a curiosity almost laughable to me, who stood onlooker and who understood. Concerning his own rages, I am convinced that they are not real, that they are sometimes experiments, but that in the main they are the habits of a pose or attitude he has seen fit to take toward his fellow men. I know, with the possible exception of the incident of the dead mate, that I have not seen him really angry. Nor do I wish to ever see him in a genuine rage, when all the force of him is called into play. While on the question of vagaries, I shall tell what befell Thomas Mugridge in the cabin, and at the same time complete an incident upon which I have already touched once or twice. The 12 o'clock dinner was over one day, and I had just finished putting the cabin in order when Wolf Larsen and Thomas Mugridge descended the companion stairs. Though the cook had a cubbyhole of a stateroom opening off from the cabin, in the cabin himself he had never dared to linger to be seen, and he fitted to and fro once or twice a day, a timid spectre. "So you know how to play nap," Wolf Larsen was saying in a pleased sort of voice. "I might have guessed an Englishman would know. I learned it myself in English ships." Thomas Mugridge was beside himself, a blithering imbecile. So pleased was he at chumming thus with the captain, the little airs he put on, and the painful striving to assume the easy carriage of a man born to a dignified place in life, would have been sickening had they not been ludicrous. He quite ignored my presence, though I credited him with being simply unable to see me. His pale, wishy-washy eyes were swimming like lazy summer seas, though what blissful visions they beheld were beyond my imaginations. "Get the cards, Hump," Wolf ordered, as they took seats at the table, "and bring out the cigars and the whiskey you'll find in my berth." I returned with the articles in time to hear the Cockney hinting broadly that there was a mystery about him, and that he might be a gentleman's son gone wrong or something or other. Also, he was a remittance man, and was paid to keep away from England. "Paid handsomely, sir," was the way he put it. "Paid handsomely to sling my hook, and keep slinging it." I had brought the customary liquor glasses, but Wolf Larsen frowned, shook his head, and signaled with his hands for me to bring the tumblers. These he filled 2/3 full with undiluted whiskey. "Old gentleman's drink," quoth Tom Mugridge, and they clinked their glasses to the glorious game of, quote, nap, end quote, lighted cigars, and fell to shuffling and dealing the cards. They played for money. They increased the amounts of the bets. They drank whiskey, they drank it neat, and I fetched more. I do not know whether Wolf Larsen cheated or not, a thing he was thoroughly capable of doing, but he won steadily. The cook made repeated journeys to his bunk for money. Each time he performed the journey with great swagger, but he never brought more than a few dollars at a time. He grew maudlin, familiar, could hardly see the cards or sit up tight. As a preliminary to another journey to his bunk, he hooked Wolf Larsen's buttonhole with a greasy forefinger and vacuously proclaimed and reiterated, "I got money. I tell yer, and I'm a gentleman's son." Wolf Larsen was affected by the drink, yet he drank glass for glass, and if anything, his glasses were fuller. There was no change in him. He did not appear even amused at others' antics. In the end, with loud protestations that he could lose like a gentleman, the cook's last money was staked on the game and lost, whereupon he leaned his head on his hands and wept. Wolf Larsen looked curiously at him, as though about to probe and vivisect him, then changed his mind, as from the foregone conclusion that there was nothing there to probe. "Hump," he said to me, elaborately polite, "kindly take Mr. Mugridge's arm and help him up on deck. He's not feeling very well. And tell Johnson to douse him with a few buckets of salt water," he added, in a lower tone for my ear alone. I left Mr. Mugridge on deck in the hands of a couple of grinning sailors who had been told off for the purpose. Mr. Mugridge was simply spluttering that he was a gentleman's son, but as I described the companion stairs to clear the table, I had heard him shriek as the first bucket of water struck him. Wolf Larsen was counting his winnings. $185 even, he said aloud, just as I thought. The beggar came aboard without a cent. "And what have you won is mine, sir," I said boldly. He favored me with a quizzical smile. "Humph, I have studied some grammar in my time, and I think your tenses are tangled. Was mine, you should have said, not is mine." "It's not a question, not of grammar, but of ethics," I answered. It was possibly a minute before he spoke. "You know, Hump," he said with slow seriousness, which had an indefinable strain of sadness, "this is the first time I've heard the words ethics in the mouth of a man. You and I are the only men on this ship who know its meaning. At one time in my life," he continued at another pause, "I dreamed that I might someday talk with men who use such language, that I might lift myself out of the place in life in which I had been born and hold conversation and mingle with men who talked about just such things as ethics. And this is the first time I have ever heard the word pronounced, which is all, by the way, for you are wrong. It is a question neither of grammar or ethics, but of fact." "I understand," I said. "The fact is that you have the money." His face brightened. He seemed pleased at my perspicacity. "But it is avoiding the real question," I continued. "Which one is right?" "Ah," he remarked with a wry pucker in his mouth, "I see you believe in such things as right and wrong." "But don't you, at all?" I demanded. "Not the least bit. Might is right, and that is all there is to it. Weakness is wrong, which is a very poor way of saying that it is good for oneself to be strong, and evil for oneself to be weak. Or better yet, it is pleasurable to be strong because of the profits, painful to be weak because of the penalties. Just now the possession of this money is a pleasurable thing. It is good for one to possess it. Being able to possess it, I wrong myself and the life that is in me if I give it to you and forego the pleasure of possessing it." But you wrong me by withholding it, I objected. Not at all. One man cannot wrong another man. He can only wrong himself. As I see it, I do wrong always when I consider the interests of others. Don't you see? How can two particles of yeast wrong each other by striving to devour each other? It is their inborn heritage to strive to devour and to strive not to be devoured. When they depart from this, they sin. Then you don't believe in altruism? I asked. He received the word as if it had a familiar ring, though he pondered it thoughtfully. Let me see, it means something about cooperation, doesn't it? Well, in a way, there has come to be sort of a connection, I answered, unsurprised by this time at such gaps in his vocabulary, which, like his knowledge, was the acquirement of a self-read, self-educated man whom no one had directed in his studies, and who had thought much and talked little or not at all. An altruistic act is an act performed for the welfare of others. It is unselfish as opposed to an act performed for oneself, which is selfish. He nodded his head. Oh, yes, I remember it now. I ran across it in Spencer. Spencer, I cried. Have you read him? Not very much, was his confession. I understand quite a good deal of first principles. His biology book took the wind out of my sails, and his psychology left me butting around in the doldrums for many a day. I honestly could not understand what he was driving at. I put it down to mental deficiency on my part. But since then, I have decided that it was for want of preparation. I had no proper basis. Only Spencer and myself know how hard I hammered. But I did get something out of his data of ethics. There's where I ran across altruism, and I remember now how it was used. I wondered what this man could have got from such a work. Spencer, I remembered enough to know that altruism was imperative to his ideal of highest conduct. Wolf Larsen evidently had sifted the great philosopher's teachings, rejecting and selecting according to his needs and desires. What else did you run across? I asked. His brows drew in slightly with the mental effort of suitably phrasing thoughts, which he had never before put into speech. I felt an elation of spirit. I was groping into his soul stuff, as he made a practice of groping in the soul stuff of others. I was exploring virgin territory. A strange, terribly strained region was unrolling itself before my eyes. In as few words as possible, he began, Spencer puts it something like this. First, a man must act for his own benefit, to do this and to be normal and good. Next, he must act for the benefit of his children. And third, he must act for the benefit of his race. And the highest, finest right conduct, I interjected, is that act which benefits at the same time the man, his children, and his race. I wouldn't stand for that, he replied. Couldn't see the necessity of it, nor the common sense. I cut out the race and the children. I would sacrifice nothing for them. Oh, it's just so much slush and sentiment, and you must see it yourself for at least one who does not believe in eternal life. With immortality before me, altruism would be playing a business proposition. I might elevate my soul to all kinds of altitudes, but with nothing eternal before me but death, given for a brief spell this yeasty crawling and squirming which is called life, why, it would be immoral for me to perform any act that was a sacrifice. Any sacrifice that makes me lose one crawl or squirm is foolish. And not only foolish, for it is a wrong against myself and a wicked thing. I must not lose one crawl or squirm, if I am to get the most out of the ferment. Nor will the eternal movelessness that is coming to me be easier or harder by the sacrifices or selfishness of the time when I was a yeastly and a crawl. Then you are an individualist, a materialist, and logically a hedonist. Big words, he smiled. What is a hedonist? He nodded in agreement when I had given the definition. And you are also, I continued, a man could not trust in the least thing where it was possible for a selfish interest to intervene. Now you're begging to understand, he said, brightening. You're a man utterly without what the word calls morals. That's it. A man of whom to always be afraid. That's the way to put it. As one is afraid of a snake, a tiger, or a shark. Now you know me, he said. And you know me as I am generally known. Other men call me Wolf. You are sort of a monster, I added audaciously, a cabin who has pondered Sisyphus, and who acts as you act, in idle moments, by whim and fancy. His brow clouded the illusion he did not understand, and I quickly learned that he did not know the poem. I'm just reading Browning, he confessed, and it's pretty tough. I haven't gotten very far along, but as it is, I've about to lose my bearings. Now, not to be tiresome, I shall say that I fetched the book from his stateroom and read Caliban aloud. He was delighted. It was a particular mode of reasoning and of looking at strange things that he understood thoroughly. He interrupted again and again with comment and criticism. When I finished, he had me read it over a second time and a third. We fell into discussion, philosophy, science, evolution, religion. He betrayed the inaccuracies of the self-read man, and it must be granted the sureness and directness of the primitive mind. The very simplicity of his reasoning was its strength, and his materialism was far more compelling than the subtly complex materialism of Charlie Froissart. Not that I, a confirmed, and as Froissart praised it, a temperamental idealist, was to be compelled, but that Wolf Larsen stormed the last strongholds of my faith with a vigor that received respect, while not accorded conviction. Time passed. Supper was at hand, and the table not laid. I became restless and anxious, and when Thomas Mugridge glared down the companionway, sick and angry of countenance, I prepared to go about my duties. But Wolf Larsen cried to him, "Cookie, you've got to hustle tonight. I'm busy with Hump, and you'll do the best you can without him." And again, the unprecedented was established. That night, I sat at table with the captain and the hunters, while Thomas Mugridge waited on us, and washed the dishes afterwards, a whim, a Caliban mood of Wolf Larsen's, and one I foresaw would bring me trouble. In the meantime, we talked and talked, much to the disgust of the hunters, who could not understand a word. Chapter 9. 3 days of rest. 3 blessed days of rest are what I had with Wolf Larsen, eating at the cabin table and doing nothing but discuss life, literature, and the universe, the while Thomas Mugridge fumed and raged and did my work as well as his own. "Watch out for squalls," is all I could say to you, was Lewis's warning, given during a spare half hour on deck while Wolf Larsen was engaged in straightening out a row among the hunters. "You can't tell me what'll be happening," Lewis went on in response to my query for more definite information. "The man's as contrary as air currents or water currents. You can never guess the ways of him. It's just as you thinkin' you know him and are making a favorable slant along him that he whirls around dead ahead, comes howling down upon you, and a ripping all of your fine weather sails to rags." So I was not altogether surprised when the squall foretold by Lewis smote me. We had been having a heated discussion, upon life of course, and grown overbold. I was passing stiff structures upon Wolf Larsen and the life of Wolf Larsen. In fact, I was vivisecting him and turning over his soul stuff as keenly and thoroughly as it was his custom to do it to others. It may be a weakness of mine that I have an incisive way of speech, but I threw all restraint to the winds and cut and slashed until the whole man of him was snarling. The dark sun bronze of his face went black with wrath. His eyes were ablaze. There was no clearness or sanity in them, nothing but the terrific rage of a madman. It was the wolf in him that I saw, and a mad wolf at that. He sprang for me with a half-roar, gripping my arm. I had steeled myself to brazen it out, though I was trembling inwardly, but the enormous strength of the man was too much for my fortitude. He had gripped me by the bicep with his single hand, and when that grip tightened, I wilted and shrieked aloud. My feet went out from under me. I simply could not stand upright and endure the agony. The muscles refused their duty. The pain was too great. My biceps was being crushed to a pulp. He seemed to recover himself, for a lucid gleam came into his eyes, and he relaxed his hold with a short laugh that was more like a growl. I fell to the floor, feeling very faint, while he sat down, lighted a cigar, and watched me as a cat watches a mouse. As I writhed about, I could see in his eyes that curiosity I had so often noted, that wonder and perplexity, that questing, that everlasting query of his as to what it was all about. I finally crawled to my feet and ascended the companion stairs. Fair weather was over. There was nothing left but to return to the galley. My left arm was numb, as though paralyzed, and days before I could use it, while weeks went by before the last stiffness and pain went out of it. And he had done nothing but put his hand upon my arm and squeeze. There had been no wrenching or jerking. He just closed his hand with a steady pressure. What he might have done, I did not fully realize till next day, when he put his head into the galley and, as a sign of renewed friendliness, asked me how my arm was getting on. "It might have been worse," he smiled. I was peeling potatoes. He picked one up from the pan. It was fair size, firm, and unpeeled. He closed his hand upon it, squeezed, and the potato squirted out between his fingers in mushy streams. The pulpy remnant he dropped back into the pan, turned away, and I had a sharp vision of how it might have fared with me had the monster put his real strength upon me. But through the 3 days' rest was good in spite of it all, for it had given my knee the very chance it needed. It felt much better. The swelling had materially decreased, and the cap seemed descending into its proper place. Also, the 3 days' rest brought the trouble I had foreseen. It was plainly Thomas Mugridge's intention to make me pay for those 3 days. He treated me vilely, cursed me continually, and heaped his own work upon me. He even ventured to raise his fist to me, but I was becoming animal-like myself, and I snarled in his face so terribly that it must have frightened him back. It is no pleasant picture I can conjure up of myself, Humphrey Van Weyden, in that noisome ship's galley, crouched in a corner over my task, my face raised to the face of the creature about to strike me, my lips lifted and snarling like a dog's, my eyes gleaming with fear and helplessness and the courage that comes of fear and helplessness. I do not like the picture. It reminds me too strongly of a rat in a trap. I do not care to think of it, but it was elective, for the threatened blow did not descend. Thomas Mugridge backed away, glaring as hatefully and viciously as I glared. A pair of beasts is what we were, penned together and showing our teeth. He was a coward, afraid to strike me because I had not quailed sufficiently in advance. So he chose a new way to intimidate me. There was only one galley knife that, as a knife, amounted to anything. This, through many years of service and wear, had acquired a long, lean blade. It was unusually cruel looking, and at first I had shuddered every time I used it. The cook borrowed a stone from Johansen and proceeded to sharpen the knife. He did it with great ostentation, glancing significantly at me the while. He whetted it up and down all day long. Every odd moment he could find, he had the knife and stone out and was whetting away. The steel acquired a razor edge. He tried it with the ball of his thumb or across the nail. He shaved hairs from the back of his hand, glanced along the edge with microscopic acuteness, and found, or feigned that he found, always a slight inequality in its edge somewhere. Then he would put it on the stone again and wet, till I could have laughed aloud. It was very ludicrous. It was also serious, for I learned that he was capable of using it, that under all his cowardice there was a courage of cowardice, like mine, that would impel him to do the very thing his whole nature protested against doing and was afraid of doing. Cookie sharpening his knife for Hump was being whispered about among the sailors, and some of them twitted him about it. This he took in good part, and was really pleased, nodding his head with direful foreknowledge and mystery, until George Leach, the erstwhile cabin boy, ventured some rough pleasantry on the subject. Now it happened that Leach was one of the sailors told off to douse Mugridge after his game of cards with the captain. Leach had evidently done his task with a thoroughness that Mugridge had not forgiven, for words followed, and evil names involving smirched ancestries. Mugridge menaced with a knife he was sharpening for me. Leach laughed and hurled more of his Telegraph Hill Billingsgate, and before he or I knew what had happened, his right arm had been ripped open from elbow to wrist by a quick slash of the knife. The cook backed away, a fiendish expression on his face, the knife held before him in a position of defense. But Leach took it quite calmly. The blood was spouting upon the deck as generously as water from a fountain. "I'm going to get you, Cookie," he said, "and I'll get you hard, and I won't be in no hurry about it. You'll be without that knife when I come for you." So saying, he turned and walked quietly forward. Mugridge's face was livid with fear at what he had done and what he might expect sooner or later from the man he had stabbed. But his demeanor toward me was more ferocious than ever. In spite of his fear at the reckoning, he must expect to pay for what he had done. He could see that it had been an object lesson to me, and he became more domineering and exultant. Also, there was lust in him, akin to madness, which had come with sight of the blood he had drawn. He was beginning to see red in whatever direction he looked. The psychology of it is sadly tangled, and yet I could read the workings of his mind as clearly as though it were printed in a book. Several days went by, the ghost still foaming down the trades, and I could swear I saw madness growing in Thomas Mugridge's eyes, and I confessed that I became afraid, very much afraid. Wet, it all went all day long. The look in his eyes as he felt the keen knowledge and glared at me was positively carnivorous. I was afraid to turn my shoulder to him. And when I left the galley, I went out backwards, to the amusement of the sailors and hunters who made a point of gathering in groups to witness my exit. The strain was too great. I sometimes thought my mind would give way under it, a meat thing on the ship of madmen and brutes. Every hour, every minute of my existence was in jeopardy. I was a human soul in distress, and yet no soul, fore or aft, betrayed sufficient sympathy to come to my aid. At times I thought of throwing myself on the mercy of Wolf Larsen, but the vision of the mocking devil in his eyes that questioned life and sneered at it would come strong upon me and compel me to refrain. At other times I seriously contemplated suicide, and the whole force of my hopeful philosophy was required to keep me from going over the side of the darkness of night. Several times Wolf Larsen tried to inveigle me into discussion, but I gave him short answers and eluded him. Finally, he commanded me to resume my seat at the cabin table for a time and let the cook do my work. And I spoke frankly, telling him I was enduring from Thomas Mugridge because of the 3 days of favoritism which had been shown me. Wolf Larsen regarded me with smiling eyes. "So, you're afraid, eh?" he sneered. "Yes," I said defiantly and honestly, "I am afraid." "That's the way with you fellas," he cried half angrily, "sentimentalizing about your immortal souls and afraid to die. At sight of a sharp knife and a cowardly cockney, the clinging of life to life overcomes all your fond foolishness. Why, dear fellow, you will live forever. You are a god, and God cannot be killed. Cookie cannot hurt you. You are sure of your resurrection. What's there to be afraid of? You have eternal life before you. You are a millionaire in immortality, and a millionaire whose fortune cannot be lost, whose fortune is less perishable than the stars and as lasting as space or time. It's impossible for you to diminish your principle. Immortality is a thing without beginning or end. Eternity is eternity, and though you die here and now, you will go on living somewhere else and hereafter. And it is all very beautiful, this shaking off of the flesh and soaring of the imprisoned spirit. Cookie cannot hurt you. He can only give you a boost on the path you eternally must tread. Or if you do not wish to be boosted just yet, why not boost Cookie? According to your ideas, he too must be an immortal millionaire. You cannot bankrupt him. His paper will always circulate at par. You cannot diminish the length of his living by killing him, for he is without beginning or end. He's bound to go on living somewhere. Somehow. Then boost him, stick a knife in him, and let his spirit free. As it is, it's in a nasty person, and you'll do him only a kindness by breaking down the door. And who knows, it may be a very beautiful spirit that will go soaring up into the blue from that ugly carcass. Boost him along, and I'll promote you to his place. And he's getting $45 a month. It was plain that I could look for no help or mercy from Wolf Larsen. Whatever was to be done, I must do for myself. And out of the courage of fear, I evolved the plan of fighting Thomas Mugridge with his own weapons. I borrowed a whetstone from Johansen. Lewis, the boat steerer, had already begged me for condensed milk and sugar. The lazarette, where such delicacies were stored, was situated beneath the cabin floor. Watching my chance, I stole 5 cans of the milk, and that night, when it was Lewis's watch on deck, I traded them with him for a dirk as lean and cruel-looking as Thomas Mugridge's vegetable knife. It was rusty and dull, but I turned the grindstone while Lewis gave it an edge. I slept more soundly than usual that night. Next morning, after breakfast, Thomas Mugridge began his wet. I glanced warily at him, for I was on my knees, taking the ashes from the stove. When I returned from throwing them overside, he was talking to Harrison, whose honest yokel's face was filled with fascination and wonder. "Yes," Mugridge was saying, "and what does his worship do but give me 2 years in Reading? But blimey if I cared. The other mug was fixed, plenty. Should have seen him. Knife just like this. I stuck it in, like into soft butter. And the way he squealed was better than 2-penny gaff. He shot a glance in my direction to see if I was taking it in, and went on, "I didn't mean it, Tommy. He was sniffling. So help me God, I didn't mean it. I'll fix you bloody well right," I says, "and keep right after him. I'm cutting him in ribbons. That's what I did, and he is squealing all the time. Once he got his and on the knife and tried to hold it, had his fingers around it, but pulled it through, cutting to the bone. Oh, he was a sight, I can tell you." A call from the maid interrupted the gory narrative, and Harrison went aft. Muggeridge sat down on the raised threshold to the galley and went on with his knife sharpening. I put the shovel away and calmly sat down on the coal box facing him. He favored me with a vicious stare. Still calmly, though my heart was going pit-a-pat, I pulled out Lewis's dirk and began to wet it on the stone. I had looked for almost any sort of explosion on the Cockney's part, but to my surprise he did not appear aware of what I was doing. He went on wetting his knife. So did I, and for 2 hours we sat there, face to face. Wet, 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 till the news of it spread aboard, and half the ship's company was crowding the galley doors to see the sight. Encouragement and advice were freely tendered, and Jock Horner, the quiet, soft-spoken hunter, who looked as though he would not harm a mouse, advised me to leave the ribs alone and to thrust upward for the abdomen, at the same time giving what he called the, quote, Spanish twist, end quote, to the blade. Leach, his bandaged arm prominently to the fore, begged me to leave a few remnants of the cook for him, and Wolf Larsen paused once or twice at the break of the poop to glance curiously at what must have been to him a stirring and crawling of the yeasty thing he knew as life. And I make free to say that for the time being life assumed the same sordid values to me. There was nothing pretty about it, nothing divine, only two cowardly moving things that sat wetting steel upon stone, and a group of other moving things, cowardly and otherwise, that looked on. Half of them, I am sure, were anxious to see us shedding each other's blood. It would have been entertainment. And I do not think there was one who would have interfered had we closed in a death struggle. On the other hand, the whole thing was laughable and childish. Wet, 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 Humphrey Van Weyden sharpening his knife in a ship's galley and trying its edge with his thumb. Of all situations, this was the most inconceivable. I know that my own kind could not have believed it possible. I had not been called, quote, sissy, end quote, Van Weyden all my days without reason, and that sissy Van Weyden should be capable of doing this thing was a revelation to Humphrey Van Weyden, who knew not whether to be exultant or ashamed. But nothing happened. At the end of 2 hours, Thomas Muggeridge put away knife and stone and held out his hand. "What's the good of making an holy show of ourselves for them mugs?" he demanded. "They don't love us, and bloody well glad they be a-seeing us cutting our throats. You're not our bad, Hump. You've got spunk, you Yanks, and I like you in a way. So come on and shike." Coward that I might be, I was less a coward than he. It was a distinct victory I had gained, and I refused to forego any of it by shaking his detestable hand. "All right," he said pridelessly, "take it or leave it. I'll like you none the less for it." And to save his face, he turned fiercely upon the onlookers. "Get out of my galley doors, you bloomin' swabs." This command was reinforced by a steaming kettle of water, and at sight of it the sailors had scrambled out of the way. This was sort of victory for Thomas Muggeridge, and enabled him to accept more gracefully the defeat I had given him. Though, of course, he was too discreet to attempt to drive the hunters away. "I see Cookie's finish," I heard Smoke say to Horner. "You bet," was the reply. "Hump runs the gallery from now on, and Cookie pulls the horns." Mugridge heard and shot a swift glance at me, but I gave no sign that the conversation had reached me. I had not thought my victory was so far-reaching and complete, but I resolved to let go nothing I had gained. As the days went by, Smoke's prophecy was verified. The Cockney became more humble and slavish to me than even to Wolf Larsen. I mistered him and stirred him no longer, washed no more greasy pots, and peeled no more potatoes. I did my own work, and my own work only, and when and in what fashion I saw fit. Also I carried Dirk in a sheath at my hip, sailor fashion, and maintained toward Thomas Mugridge a constant attitude, which was composed of equal parts of domineering, insult, and contempt. Chapter 10. My intimacy with Wolf Larsen increases, if by intimacy may be denoted those relations which exist between master and man, or, better yet, between king and jester. I am to him no more than a toy, and he values me no more than a child values a toy. My function is to amuse, and so long as I amuse, all goes well. But let him become bored, or let him have one of his black moods come upon him, and at once I am relegated from cabin table to galley, while, at the same time, I am fortunate to escape with my life and a whole body. The loneliness of the man is slowly being borne in upon me. There is not a man aboard but hates or fears him, nor is there a man whom he does not despise. He seems consuming with a tremendous power that is in him, and that seems never to have found adequate expression in works. He is as Lucifer would be, were that proud spirit banished to a society of soulless, Tomlinsonian ghosts. This loneliness is bad enough in itself, but, to make it worse, he is oppressed by the primal melancholy of the race. Knowing him, I review the old Scandinavian myths with clearer understanding. The white-skinned, fair-haired savages who created that terrible pantheon were of the same fiber as he. The frivolity of the laughter-loving Latins is no part of him. When he laughs, it is from a humor that is nothing else than ferocious. But he laughs, rarely. He is too often sad, and it is a sadness as deep-reaching as the roots of the race. It is the race heritage, the sadness which has made the race sober-minded, clean-lived, and fanatically moral, and which in this latter connection has culminated among the English in the Reformed Church and Ms. Grundy. In point of fact, the chief vent to this primal melancholy has been religion in its more agonizing forms. But the compensations of such religion are denied Wolf Larsen. His brutal materialism will not permit it. So when his blue moods come in, nothing remains for him but to be devilish. Were he not so terrible a man, I could sometimes feel sorry for him, as instance 3 mornings ago, when I went into his stateroom to fill his water bottle and come unexpectedly upon him. He did not see me. His head was buried in his hands, and his shoulders were heaving convulsively as with sobs. He seemed torn by some mighty grief. As I softly withdrew, I can hear him groaning, "God! God! God!" Not that he was calling upon God. It was a mere expletive, but it came from his soul. At dinner, he asked the hunters for a remedy for headache, and by evening, strong man that he was half blind and reeling about the cabin. "I've never been sick in my life, Hump," he said, as I guided him to his room. "Nor did I ever have a headache, except the time my head was healing after having been laid open for 6 months by a capstan bar." For 3 days this blinding headache lasted, and he suffered, as wild animals suffer, as it seemed the way on ship to suffer, without plaint, without sympathy, utterly alone. This morning, however, on entering his stateroom to make the bed and put things in order, I found him well and hard at work. Table and bunk were littered with designs and calculations on a large transparent sheet. Compass and square in hand, he was copying what appeared to be a scale of some sort or other. "Hello, Hump," he greeted me genially. "I'm just finishing the finishing touches. Want to see it work?" "But what is it?" I asked. "A labor-saving device for mariners, navigation reduced to kindergarten simplicity," he answered gaily. "From today, a child will be able to navigate a ship. No more long-winded calculations. All you need is one star in the sky on a dirty night to know instantly where you are. Look, I place a transparent scale on this star map, revolving the scale on the North Pole. On the scale, I've worked out the circles of altitude and the lines of bearing. All I do is to put it on a star, revolve the scale till it is opposite those figures on the map underneath, and presto, there you are, the ship's precise location." There was a ring of triumph in his voice, and his eyes, clear blue this morning as the sea, were sparkling with lights. "You must be well up in mathematics," I said. "Where did you go to school?" "Never saw the inside of one. Worse luck," was the answer. "I had to dig it out for myself." "And why do you think I have made this thing?" he demanded abruptly. "Dreaming to leave footprints on the sands of time?" he laughed, one of his horrible mocking laughs. "Not at all. To get it patented. To make money from it. To revel in piggishness with all might in while other men do the work. That's my purpose. Also, I have enjoyed working it out." "The creative joy," I murmured. "I guess that's what it ought to be called, which is another way of expressing the joy of life in that it is alive, the triumph of movement over matter, of the quick over the dead, the pride of the yeast because it is yeast and crawls." I threw up my hands with helpless disapproval of his inveterate materialism and went about making the bed. He continued copying lines and figures upon the transparent scale. It was a task requiring the utmost nicety and precision, and I could not but admire the way he tempered his strength to the fineness and delicacy of the need. When I had finished the bed, I caught myself looking at him in a fascinated sort of way. He was certainly a handsome man, beautiful in the masculine sense. And again, with never-failing wonder, I remarked the total lack of viciousness or wickedness or sinfulness in his face. It was the face, I am convinced, of a man who did no wrong. And by this, I do not wish to be misunderstood. What I mean is that it was the face of a man who either did nothing contrary to the dictates of his conscience, or who had no conscience. I am inclined to the latter way of accounting for it. He was a magnificent atavism, a man so purely primitive that he was of the type that came into the world before the development of the mortal nature. He was not immoral, but merely unmoral. As I have said, in the masculine sense, his was a beautiful face. Smooth-shaven, every line was distinct, and it was cut as clear and sharp as a cameo, while sea and sun had tanned the naturally fair skin to a dark bronze, which bespoke struggle and battle and added both to his savagery and his beauty. The lips were full, yet possessed of the firmness, almost harshness, which is characteristic of thin lips. The set of his mouth, his chin, his jaw, was likewise firm or harsh, with all the fierceness and indomitableness of the male. The nose also. It was the nose of a being born to conquer and command. It just hinted of the eagle beak. It might have been Grecian. It might have been Roman, only it was a shade too massive for the one, a shade too delicate for the other. And while the whole face was the incarnation of fierceness and strength, the primal melancholy from which he suffered seemed to greeten the lines of mouth and eye and brow, seemed to give a largeness and completeness which otherwise the face would have lacked. And so I caught myself, standing idly and studying him. I cannot say how greatly the man had come to interest me. Who was he? What was he? How had he happened to be? All powers seemed his, all potentialities. Why then was he no more than the obscure master of a seal-hunting schooner with a reputation for frightful brutality amongst the men who hunted seals? My curiosity burst from me in a flood of speech. Why is it that you have not done great things in this world? With a power that is yours, you might have risen to any height. Unpossessed of conscience or moral instinct, you might have mastered the world, broken it to your hand. And yet here you are at the top of your life, where diminishing and dying begin, living an obscure and sordid existence, hunting sea animals for the satisfaction of woman's vanity and love of decoration, reveling in a piggishness, to use your own words, which is anything and everything except splendid. Why, with all that wonderful strength, have you not done something? There was nothing to stop you, nothing that could stop you. What was wrong? Do you lack ambition? Did you fall under temptation? What was the matter? What was the matter? He lifted his eyes to me at the commencement of my outburst, and followed me complacently until I had done and stood before him breathless and dismayed. He waited a moment, as though seeking where to begin, and then said, "Hump, do you know the parable of the sower who went forth to sow? If you will remember, some of the seed fell upon stony places, where there was not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them." "Well," I said. "Well?" he queried, half petulantly. "It was not well. I was one of those seeds." He dropped his head to the scale and resumed the copying. I finished my work and opened the door to leave, when he spoke to me. "Humph, if you will look on the west coast of the map of Norway, you will see an indentation called Romsdal Fjord. I was born within 100 miles of that stretch of water. But I was not born in the region. I am a Dane. My father and mother were Danes, and how they ever came to bleak bite of land on the west coast I do not know. I never heard. Outside of that, there's nothing mysterious. There were poor people and unlettered. They came generations of poor unlettered people, peasants of the sea, who sowed their sons on the waves, as has been their custom since time began. There is no more to tell." "But there is," I objected. "It is still obscure to me." "What can I tell you?" he demanded with a recrudescence of fierceness. "Of the meagerness of a child's life, a fish diet and coarse living, of going out with the boats from the time I can crawl, of my brothers who went away one by one to the deep sea farming and never came back, of myself unable to read or write, cabin boy at the mature age of 10 on the coastwise old country ships, of the rough fare and rougher usage where kicks and blows were bed and breakfast and took the place of speech, and fear and hatred were my only sole experiences. I do not care to remember. My madness comes up in my brain even now as I think of it. But there were coastwise skippers I would have returned and killed when a man's strength came to me. Only the lines of my life were cast at the time in other places. I did return not long ago, but unfortunately the skippers were dead, all but one. A mate in the old days, the skipper when I met him, and when I left him a cripple who would never walk again." "But you read Spencer and Darwin and have never seen the inside of a school. How did you learn to read and write?" I queried. "In the English merchant service. Cabin boy at 12, ship's boy at 14, ordinary seaman at 16, able seaman at 17, and cock of the forecastle, infinite ambition and infinite loneliness, receiving neither help nor sympathy. I did it all for myself. Navigation, mathematics, science, literature, and whatnot. And of what use has it been? Master and owner of a ship at the top of my life, as you say, when I'm beginning to diminish and die. Paltry, isn't it? And when the sun was up, I was scorched. Because I had no root, I withered away. But history tells of slaves who rose to the purple, I chided. And history tells of opportunities that came to the slaves who rose to the purple, he answered grimly. No man makes opportunity. All the great men ever did was to know when it came to them. The Corsican knew. I have dreamed as greatly as the Corsican. I should have known the opportunity, but it never came. The thorn sprung up and choked me. And Hump, I can tell you, you know more about me than any living man, except my own brother. And what is he? Where is he? Master of the steamship Macedonia, seal hunter, was the answer. We will meet him most probably on the Japan coast. Men call him, quote, Death, end quote, Larson. Death Larson, I involuntarily cried. Is he like you? Hardly. He's a lump of an animal without any head. He has all my brutishness, I suggested. Yes, thank you for the word, all my brutishness. But he can scarcely read or write. And he has never philosophized on life, I added. No, Wolf Larson answered with an indescribable air of sadness. And he is all the happier for leaving life alone. He's too busy living it to think about it. My mistake was in ever opening the books.